What's up everybody, we're back in Uldir, but this time it's with a tank guide. So in this video I will be going over what you need to know to tank Mythic Uldir. And if you're watching this, I assume you're already familiar with the overall mythic tactics, so I won't be covering that. If you want a complete guide for each and every fight, just hop on over to my channel and you will find them there. So this will be more tank specific mechanics, tips and tricks, and how I approach the fights during progression. This will be boss by boss, so if you've already done a few, just skip on ahead. I'll leave timestamps in the descriptions to each encounter so you can get there faster. And if you'd like me to make more tank specific guides on top of my other guides, let me know in the comments and we'll see what we can fix. So let's start this thing off with the master of all boss designs, Taloc. So there's not a whole lot I can tell you about this encounter. The only new thing here is the enlarged heart debuff, which targets whichever tank that's currently tanking, and it deals a ton of damage that is split between everyone within 8 yards of that tank. So if you want to save it, just have anyone that can stack on that tank and you're safe. However, you can also run out and solo it with things like Bubble, Blessing of Spell Warding, Send Med, and stuff like that. Other than that, he hits a bit harder in Mythic, but the fight is the same as in any other difficulty. So let's move on to Mother instead. Again, not a whole lot has changed from any other difficulty. She hits a lot harder, but that's about it. Depending on what strategy you're going for and your overall team comp and raid DPS, a few things can change. So if you're going with the most common tactic, or at least I think it is, where you bring 15 players over immediately, well then you can solo tank it if you have high enough AoE DPS and access to a few AoE stuns. This is mainly due to the ads that spawns in the second room will be killed off during the stuns, so there's no need for a second tank. However, if you can't kill them before they start killing off the raid, you might want to take a second tank anyways. And on top of this, Mother can bug out a bit when you go 2 tanks and 15 players run over. For some reason the tank that isn't tanking Mother can randomly get aggro and she just runs over and it's pretty much a wipe. So whoever tanks Mother needs to be quick on the taunt if this happens, or you can use Blessing of Protection on the other tank as you move over to make sure he or she doesn't randomly get aggro. If any of you know what triggers it or any other ways to avoid it, please let me know in the comments because I have no idea. If you aren't going with 15 players crossing over instantly, then it's pretty much like heroic all over. Other than that, there's not a lot to it. Make sure you always track her frontal cone so that you face her away from the raid when she casts it, and that's pretty much it. So let's move on to something a bit more challenging, namely Zek'voz. It's a pretty straightforward encounter as far as tanking goes. Just like any and all bosses in Uldir, his regular auto attacks hits fairly hard, but it's his combo or technique that you need to prepare for. So as you probably know, he uses 2 different attacks during his combo. One is the Void Lash, which deals a high amount of shadow damage and reduces healing taken by 50%, which stacks, and Shatter, which deals a high amount of physical damage and increases damage taken by his next Shatter. The combo is always the same: Void Lash, Shatter, Void Lash. So either you taunt after the second Void Lash or after Shatter. Taunting after the second Void Lash means the combo tank will take a very large amount of damage during a short window and will be healing immune for a couple of seconds. If done incorrectly, you'll end up dead or at very low HP, which can result in your death if the other tank is a bit slow on the taunt. If you go for the other approach, which is taunting after the Shatter, then one tank will take Void Lash plus Shatter and the second tank takes 1 Void Lash. This will result in far less burst damage taken, so there's less of a risk that that tank dies. But the second tank will have to tank Zek'voz for a while with 50% healing reduction, which, if not careful, can result in that tank's untimely demise. So whichever approach you go for is up to you, but I suggest planning ahead a bit with cooldowns and what your class can use to make it easier. Knowing that the combo is both magical and physical damage, you can use different things to handle it. You can use Anti-Magic Shell and Blessing of Spell Warding to ignore Void Lashes completely, Bubbles to ignore all of it, and often you can time your overall damage reduction cooldowns to be up for both Void Lashes and Shatter if you go for that approach. Other than that, overall, as I said, it's pretty straightforward. Communicate with your raid if you have to pull the boss around during Surging Darkness. Some of the tank combos will be during a Surging Darkness, so either have predetermined spots for where you take the boss, or tell people to avoid the front of the boss during it. You don't want to Void Lash the raid, I can tell you that much. And make sure to position the boss close to where the small ads will spawn, preferably on the Void Weaver that spawns close to him, and always pull the boss to whichever Void Weaver you're currently nuking, just to squeeze out a bit more DPS. And on to the next one, we have Vectis. So going from heroic to mythic, the only difference you'll notice is, well, everything hurts a lot more. As far as mechanics goes, it's the same. However, if you're like a lot of people who tank swaps at 2 stacks, I highly recommend swapping on 1 stack instead when you're on mythic. You will always be able to drop your debuff even if you taunt on 1 stack, but you will take far less damage this way. The only down part is that sometimes you won't be able to taunt the ad that spawns from gestate. But if you're not tanking the boss and the ad spawns, just move over and smack it around a bit and you'll be fine. Whichever approach you go for is up to you, but there's something to look out for regardless of tactic, and that's immunosuppression. The ad will cost something called immunosuppression, which is a healing absorb. If you have 1 or 2 stacks of evolving affliction while tanking the ad or the boss and that goes off, you should probably use a cooldown. The ad hits pretty damn hard, and the combination of ad damage, evolving affliction, the raid-wide damage from contagion, and the healing absorb can be pretty damn devastating. However, you can skip the healing absorb with things like bubble, blessing of spell warding, or AMS to make things a bit easier. That was my approach to it, at least. If I had the debuff and I was tanking an ad or the boss during immunosuppression and contagion, I tried to have some kind of cooldown running, either my own or a healer's. Everything is on a timer, so it's very predictable, and it will always play out the same pull after pull after pull, so getting a hang of it is pretty simple. So try and be consistent with where you use cooldowns and where you use externals, and it will be very easy for you. On the subject of timings though, keep in mind that 1 tank needs to pull the boss away a bit from the raid a few seconds before Vectis casts Liquefy. This is so the raid doesn't get additional stacks from his blood pool when it swirls around. I usually used a gateway that was placed pretty much underneath me, so when there was a few seconds left before Liquefy, I clicked it and kept running until he started casting it. Other than that, avoid getting any stacks of lingering infection. You don't want Omega Vector, and you do not want to get touched by the blood waves during intermission. A few stacks is fine, but it will make the last 20% or so much harder than it has to be. And with that being said, let's move on to Fetid, the Fetid Devourer. Fun fight, non-stop heart attacks. So, following the theme of Uldir, if you tanked heroic, you've tanked mythic. Mechanically at least. However, Fetid has stepped up his game a lot. He hits like an absolute beast. So I'll be dividing this into either tanking Fetid or taking the Thrash. So if you're tanking Fetid, you'll be getting non-stop slapped across the room. There's nothing tricky about it, it's just that he really hurts. The biggest thing for you to think about is positioning. You want to stay in a spot where you won't move an inch during knockbacks. Other than that, beware that during stomps, healers might have range issues. So that would be the prime time to use your defensive cooldowns. You should use both your own and the healer's externals just to make things easier. And post 50% when the boss enrages. If you have a Resto Shaman or Discipline Priest, you can and should use Spirit Link and Disc Barrier as a tank cooldown. They won't need them anyways. On top of this, during the Stomp cast and Breath cast, you want to regain any active mitigation stacks, unless you're a monk and you just laugh at that. If possible, save heavier cooldowns for post 50% as he starts to hit a lot harder during that half of the fight. So let's take a look at the Thrash tank instead. Here's where the heart attacks come on in. You will take a very large hit every 4th auto attack Fetid does on the main tank. So a lot of times you'll get knocked down to anything between 10 to 40% depending on what class you play, and this is scary. It is very scary. However, there's really no other damage at all, so it's pretty easy to handle. You need to be topped off before the next Thrash and you're fine. If you're a tank with active mitigation like a Paladin, you need to be on your toes. If you do not have Shield of the Righteous up for a Thrash, you die. Unless you luck out with a block. Same thing with Warrior and I'd assume Demon Hunter as well. If you're a tank with healing, you want to cram out as much of that as possible in between any Thrash to help out your healers. There's generally no need for cooldowns or externals when you're the Thrash tank. Externals are better left for the tank tanking Fetid. However, if you're at say 60-70% HP and a Thrash is being cast, yes, pop a cooldown, but there's no golden moments to use one. My rule of thumb was pretty much, does it look like I might not get topped off before the Thrash, then I use a cooldown, otherwise not. What you can use though is Blessing of Protection. Thrash isn't threat based, it's proximity based, so if you have Bop or Bubble, you'll take no damage, which is very nice to use if you need to regain some active mitigation stacks or overall post 50%. Other than that, stick to your co-tank like glue and make sure that you're always on the receiving end of Thrash. And this brings us to Zool Reborn. So let's start off with phase 1. The overall mechanics are the same. The big difference here is ad management. You'll either be tanking the Crusher, the Crags, or nothing at all during phase 1. If you're the Crusher tank, it's heroic all over. Get the Crusher away from Zool and his minions before thrumming Pulse, and avoid cleaving the raid. However, if you're the lucky soul who gets to tank the Crags, I have a few tips for you. Your job is pretty much making sure you have aggro on any and all Crags at all time and making sure the Crags don't hit you too much. You also want to kite the Crags around 10 yards away from Zool so that the rogues can hit them with their Shuriken Storm, but the rest of the raid won't hit them as much. It is important that you don't get the Crags to run through the raid, as they can very easily die from that, which will greatly reduce the rogues' damage. On top of this, you always need to keep a lookout for new Crags that spawn and old Crags that resurrect, so taunt as much as possible and try and keep aggro on them. Don't overnuke them. If you have aggro, then it's fine. You don't need to go crazy on them, seeing as you still want them to be alive for a bit. This is mostly the case with the first 8 Crags. After that, it's pretty much whatever. And lastly, in phase 1, if you're the tank that tanks nothing, the only thing I can say is just nuke Zool and avoid AoEing. You don't want to have any Crags on you when you enter phase 2. Which brings us to phase 2, where the fun starts. If you're the Crag tank, just keep doing the same old thing, with the slight difference being AoE like crazy. You don't need to care if the Crags die faster here, as there will be tons of them. And this is because you really want to make sure the other 2 tanks don't get any Crags on them. Soul hurts plenty, so do whatever you can to keep all the Crags on you and keep kiting them around Zool. So when phase 2 starts, there will be a Crusher up, so whoever's tanking the Crusher in phase 1 will still be tanking it in phase 2. You just handle it the same way as in phase 1. The raid will nuke it down fast, you only need to be tanking the Crusher a very short while in phase 2. And the tank who wasn't tanking anything in phase 1 will start tanking Zool in phase 2. Generally, you swap on 3 stacks, but if you have very strong cooldowns and things like Blessing of Protection at your disposal, you can take 4 or 5 stacks, which makes the encounter a bit less hectic during the last few percent. Zool himself hurts a great deal during phase 2, especially combined with the bleed dot, and even more if a dark revelation goes off while you're tanking. So it is important that you have a defensive or external on you when you get around 2 stacks, and be ready to use 1 more when you run out to drop the blood pool if you don't have Blessing of Protection to instantly remove it. I don't recommend that you take more than 3 stacks if you don't have Blessing of Protection, but if you do, you want to make sure you use your weaker cooldowns or externals when you get around 2 stacks, saving the bigger ones like Pain Suppression for when you reach around 4 stacks, so that it will be up between the 4th and 5th stack a bit while you run out. To give you an idea of how it could look, when I was on my DK, I used Sacrifice or Iron Bark at around 2 stacks and Vamp Blood plus Bone Storm when I reached 4 stacks. Second time I used Icebound when I reached 2 stacks, and if needed, another external after that. All in all, the 2 tanks who aren't tanking Crags will tank Zool twice during this phase. So it's important that you manage your cooldowns and externals so you survive it both times. Doesn't matter too much if you die the second time you tank him when you get 3 stacks, but if you can avoid it, all the better. And don't forget to run out as far as you can when you drop the blood pools. Moving on to Mythrax. Following the theme of Uldir again, mechanically it's about the same as on Heroic. However, there's a few overlaps to take note of, and managing your annihilation stacks is a lot more important this time around. You want to position the boss in the middle of the room, and if the ad spawns near the front of Mythrax, you want to turn him a bit as to avoid essence shearing the raid. You still want to tank swap after every essence shear, and the tank that got the essence shear needs to make sure they clear their annihilation stacks in between every essence shear. This can be a bit of a hassle. You will spawn a few orbs when you get sheared. However, sometimes they cleanse 12 to 14 of your stacks, sometimes they only cleanse like 6. So it is important that you always, if needed, run around and pick up any orbs you can around the room. DPS and healers won't need them unless they're at 15 to 20 stacks, so be greedy, go get them orbs. Make sure to keep an eye on Oblivion Sphere's timer when you're running around so you don't run over someone and get mind controlled with them. It is very important that you maintain low stacks as much as possible during phase 1 for 2 reasons. First of all, Mythrax hurts like hell, and secondly, it can get out of hand really fast, especially during phase 2, but I'll get to that. So on the subject of Mythrax hitting like a truck, what you really want to look out for is Essence Shear itself here. And this is mainly due to the fact that Mythrax auto swing timer doesn't stop during it. So you can get an auto attack and 1 second later you get Essence Sheared followed instantly by another auto attack. Meaning you can get completely crushed during a very short window. That combined with someone breaking a mind control at the same time, and well, it's not awesome. So simply make sure you have a cooldown or external up for each and every Essence Shear. On top of this, Mythrax uses spell queuing, so DBM and bigwig timers aren't 100% accurate for Essence Shear. It does however have a cast time, so it's pretty easy to react to. On top of this, Essence Shear itself is also magic damage, so you can mitigate a lot of it with things like spell warding and anti-magic shell. So let's move on to phase 2 or intermission, whatever you want to call it. During this, you'll either be the tank that goes with the raid or the tank that goes to the other side with just a healer. So let's start out with the tank that goes with the raid. During this phase you'll move between 2 set locations in between every beam, and you want to keep the big ad next to the raid at all times. So it is very important that you always pull the ad into the raid and then back off a bit, so he stays nice and close but doesn't essence shear the raid. And this is where the annihilation stacks can really get out of hand. If you have around 15-20 stacks when intermission starts, you'll immediately get 10 more stacks. You can get rid of some of the stacks with the orbs that drops, but most of them you can't. Seeing as you need to move the ad to the raid immediately, you will get at least 1 essence shear from the ad, which adds another 20 stacks, and that shear usually happens right before the raid moves back, meaning they will run over the ad and steal your orbs. So as soon as that essence shear goes off, try and run around and pick up as many as possible, and after the third beam the ad should be dead. At that point, just run out and start collecting orbs. It doesn't matter if you accidentally get hit by the beam here, it does not give you high stacks instantly and it doesn't hurt too much. Just make sure to get your stacks down as much as possible. And while you're running around cleansing, the other tank will move his ad over to your side, doing the same thing as you did. If you're fast with cleansing your stacks, you can take that ad from him so he can go cleanse as well. Or if you're slow, he'll just have to cleanse it after it's dead and you start tanking the boss. So let's switch side. If you're the tank that takes the ad to the opposite side of the raid, the only thing you need to make sure of is that the ad stays interrupted. We just had our warlocks put their interrupt pet on that ad, so you could use them as interrupts. And start moving the ad after the third beam. Try and pick up any orbs you can while you're moving over, but don't go out of your way to pick them up. It's more important that the ad reaches the raid fast. And as soon as the ad dies or the other tank taunts it off, run off and clear your stacks as much as possible. After this, it's phase 1 again and rinse repeat. The only slight difference to phase 1 is post 20% due to the fact that you can't get rid of your annihilation stacks anymore. So what we did here is we had one tank take all essence shears and the other tank just tanks it in between. It's perfectly fine taking essence shear even if you have 60 stacks, just as long as you have some cooldowns and externals. And that's pretty much it. Sounds way worse than it is. Just get a hang of cleansing your stacks and you'll be fine. Which brings us to the final boss, Gahun. So let's start off with phase 1. How, when, and what you tank during phase 1 largely depends on your gauntlet orders, who runs when and stuff like that. You only really need one tank for phase 1, so I'll just go over phase 1 from a generic tank perspective. All in all, it's the same as heroic, but positioning the Dark Young correctly will help out a lot. So at the start of the encounter, you want to pull the Dark Young to the 3 terrors on the right side. You want to position it so that its Dark Bargain hits at least 2 of them. You yourself can step out of it if you want to take less damage. The DPS increase you get is not that important. However, if you're not worried about damage taken, go for it. You can stay close to these ads for a couple of seconds. I usually stay around 8 seconds after the Dark Bargain before I start running again. This is mostly so you can spread ignite and stuff from him. So after a couple of seconds I make a 180 and run towards the left ramp. We usually have a mark roughly where I need to go, so I always follow that. Here the 3 new terrors will spawn, and again if you position it just right you'll hit at least 2 of them, which means more damage taken on them. After this, there's not a whole lot of movement until the Blight Spreader spawns, so at this point help out nuking, interrupting terrors and killing spawns of Gahun. Depending on how you divided tank labor, you'll either just be tanking the Dark Young, the Blight Spreader, or both of them. If you're tanking both, make sure to use cooldowns and make sure to help out with interrupting the Blight Spreader. If you get Explosive Corruption and you're tanking the Blight Spreader, only run out if the Blight Spreader is casting. It won't randomly melee someone mid-cast, but if you interrupt it, it will. All in all, phase 1 is pretty much the same as in Heroic, just with lots and lots of balls flying around, and the Dark Young actually hits pretty hard. So let's move on to phase 2 instead. There's a few differences from Heroic here. You have the bursting boils and there's no longer any explosive corruptions here. So from a tanking point of view, it's fairly straightforward. Gahun's corrupting bite resets anytime Gahun auto-attacks a new target. So the best way to deal with this is simply to taunt off cooldown. Doing so keeps Gahun stacks at 3 or below at all time, meaning you take a lot less damage than you otherwise would. The only exception to this is when the Gibbering Horror ad spawns. This ad deals a ton of damage, so you really don't want to tank it and Gahun at the same time. So what we did was one tank on Gahun and one on the ad. The ad tank taunts Gahun every now and then, usually at 7 or 9 stacks, and then the Gahun tank taunts Gahun back as soon as the stacks drop. And if you're tanking the ad, you also need to pull the ad away before it dies. We made sure it died next to where Gahun crawls out so that the big patch in Gahunis spawns away from the raid. Other than that, it's simply spam your taunts and make sure to use cooldowns and externals, especially when the ad is up. A few things you can do to make life a bit easier in phase 2 while tanking. First of all, avoid soaking the very first boil when phase 2 starts, or the first boil after the beam in phase 2. Usually, not always due to spell queuing, but usually the second boil is at the same time or directly after the Blood Feast. You won't be taking the first and the third Blood Feast as a tank, so if you don't take the first boil, you will always be able to take the boils that spawn during those Blood Feasts, which helps out a lot. Keep in mind though that you really need to reset your stacks during the second and fourth Blood Feast. If you're a tank with high mobility like a Warrior Monk or Demon Hunter, you can try to always soak boils that are far away or in a really crappy position. Just make sure that the other tank is aware of it, because he will be tanking Gahun a bit longer during those moments. And that's pretty much phase 2. So let's take a look at the final phase. Tanking wise, it doesn't differ a lot from phase 2. You still want to taunt as often as possible to keep the stacks low, and you want to soak boils if possible. However, in this phase, you do not want to go out of your way to soak boils as a tank. It is very important that Gahun stays smack down in the middle of the room. If he moves around, then it will make things so much more difficult for the rest of the raid during the malignant growths. Other than that, it's important that you still dodge the growths, they hurt like hell, and make sure to stay spread during Wave of Corruption. Try and stand as close as possible to Gahun to leave as much space as possible for melee during growths, and as I said, only soak if you don't have to move a lot. Use weaker externals like Iron Bark a lot and save things like Pain Suppression for the last few percent when the damage starts to ramp up a lot. And I think that pretty much covers it. I hope this helps you guys with tackling Mythic Uldir, and if you want to see more tank guides overall, please let me know in the comments below. This is just a bit of a trial thing for me, but if I get good feedback on it, I'll make sure to make another one for Battle of the Zara lore, or whatever it's called. I might have missed a few things here and there, but overall I think it covers most need to know and a few tips and tricks for Uldir. If you have any questions at all, make sure to hit me up in the comments below. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave me a like, and ring that notification bell and switch it to all. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.